Do you think that our history around so-called inclusive practice is so strongly informed by this idea of a disabled identity and a non-disabled identity? I want to acknowledge my cynicism around what dance requires from disabled people working in dance. And do we exist in this binary of I identify as disabled, that person is not disabled, and actually by that something that is tangible, visible, labelable, I know that's not a word, so that we can kind of really obviously say that we're doing it. And where that becomes problematized is where we can't see or explain the experience of disability and that perhaps exists in that messy space. So does dance try and neaten us up, I think is what I'm saying, within those binaries? Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm just trying to formulate my response to that. So
okay, whenever it comes.
Yeah, I'm like warming up my brain.
Just dance it out. Show me and dance.
Like hands are so much more articulate right now than my mouth. Yeah, I'll just kind of ramble and then we'll kind of make sense from that rather than me kind of trying to pinpoint an articulate answer. So there's something about obviously like dance being such a visual art form and the way in which we understand historically who we understand as disabled or not is kind of fundamentally by their physicality, you know. So within that, it's like because we've had, in terms of the conversations that we've had before, I've spoke about my lived experience as a neurodivergent mind body who passes and is in lots of ways and in lots of contexts non-disabled, but within I'm disabled by the context of dance. How, when I'm performing and my disabled lived experience is not able to be seen and a disclosure is not able to happen, or at least even if a disclosure happens, does somebody know what that actually means in the mind-body experience in terms of what they're looking right now? How is that person then seen? So there's something about like representation maybe.
I wonder how that is for you to exist in this passing body.
Well, I think in terms of like the touring thing that you're saying or the repertoire, I think that would be possible for me. And I think that's something that I could do if the right accommodations were there. And also maybe there's something about the choreographic languages as well in terms of like the really virtuosic, you know, things that the body can do. My body, I think, would have the capacity to perform that virtuosity had I had the privilege of accessing contemporary dance training, which I've tried to do on multiple occasions, because I'm like, give me the virtuosic body, like I want it, like give me the skills, but not being able to get those.
And we've talked about that before, haven't we? The seduction of the virtuosic body, that there's often an assumption around crip practice that isn't in us. And I'm again, this feels almost uncomfortable to say out loud because I'm so aligned with crip practice and I really feel very at home in that space. But I do acknowledge there's a part of me that wants to move with set material in unison, that craves that kind of normative way of moving. And I think that's the fundamental thing maybe that's history and conditioning, and just like you, just always being the only one or the odd one out, or existing in a body that doesn't, or a body mind that doesn't fit into the training. So maybe it's very I feel like it's very difficult to let go of that, to go, I give up on it. And sometimes I'm really in that space. Sometimes I'm really in that space of I just don't need it. But I can also really clock, I'm a bit seduced by it.
I totally identify with that. And I think that a lot of my kind of focus of my practice and where I'm putting my energy is trying to distance myself from that, as you said, maybe conditioned desire to assimilate, and to be kind of get that validation of you know, being that kind of body and being able to also feel the pleasure of moving in time with others and being a part of the pack and kind of feeling that acceptance. So it's a big thing. So there's something about language and codification, and so two things: time frame and language. Let's put pins in those because I have things to say about both of those. With language, there are these kind of historic codifications of what is good and what is not good, and that pertains to both, like as you said, flexibility and positions of the body and bodily ability and virtuosity, blah blah blah, but also the kind of mind virtuosity of being like 5, 6, 7, 8, we can all do this, now let's do it on the other side, woohoo, oh my goodness, aren't we all so great at picking things up, and how those things are limiting. So there's that side of what we've inherited. But then there's also, and I think, that's inherited. And I think that within form, that can be disrupted and that can be disordered and torn apart by finding and exploring, as you said, things that are already within dance practice and culture, like improvisation, like, you know, fluidity and connecting to the kind of somatic experience of the body, and kind of working choreographically from that, the internal dance rather than the external dance. When you were talking about picking things up quickly, I think that's got to do with what we've inherited, but I also think that's got something to do with the capitalist structure in which we live in, right? Because at the end of the day, time is money with these capitalist systems, and I'm expensive as a dancer, do you know what I mean? For me to pick something up will literally take more time, which then will take more studio space, which then will take more blah, blah, blah. So if you're working from a structure where everybody needs to remember the same thing and it needs to be taught onto bodies, then I inherently am a less desirable member of the company because I cost more money.
We need to equate dance disability in the context of a capitalist society.
Absolutely.
And those conversations are happening in disability studies, but we need to have them in dance studies as well.
And because it not only is it incredibly important for the people who it affects, you know what I mean, but it's also important in terms of like, well, what kind of future are we carving out here? We're in late stage capitalism. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not looking dead rosy from here on out. Do you know what I mean? Like, we cannot keep going at that same level. We cannot keep doing it. And, you know, disabled people are the people that feel the brunt of it quickest. And of, you know, trying to create these solutions and have these conversations, but people need to listen. And it was something that within all of this stuff that we're talking about will benefit everyone. My notes are like both me capturing things that have been said in the presentations, but also some of it is kind of like my thoughts, but mainly just capturing what's in there. This first panel was practitioner perspectives and various different presenters in different fields. So some really interesting questions that came up that they were asking were, how do we know that this person is consenting? What is the role of dance artists in relation to consent? And what does this mean for their dance practice and the implications of their dance practice?
The thing that pops up for me is that we're discussing this in the context of intersectionality or inclusive dance or inclusive practices. And I have this question. I wonder what happens if we remove that frame. if we kind of, because that raises questions for me in the role of the dance artist, which came up in that panel, of how do you gauge or monitor consent? How do you even gauge or pick up on sensory communication or communication through touch? It's so subjective that it feels for me like it disrupts the whole teacher student or participant facilitator relationship, because how can we know who's having what experience? And then to go back to removing the frame of thinking about this in terms of how we understand inclusive dance, what if we apply that thinking to everybody? And I want to be careful, because you and I both know, we've spoken about this before, I don't want to remove the beautiful and affirmative experience of identifying as disabled. I'm not saying here we're all the same. That's not what I mean. But actually, I'm interested in the benefit of thinking about consent, for example, in that way. Well, why wouldn't we think about that in a non-inclusive setting? Because I don't think it's thought about in the same way. Which raises the interesting and perhaps slightly side point about the perception of disabled people as vulnerable. Yeah, which is a big one.
Yeah, and also who can kind of advocate for themselves.
I really want to advocate for unpacking some of the assumptions we make in dance. So where I think you're leaning towards, which is really interesting to me, is if we are in a non-verbal environment. So even if you are a language user and you're dancing with someone who is not a language user, actually the language that you probably would shift into is touch. And I wonder about the assumptions we make as dancers, that we read consent into touch, that we kind of go, oh, that touch feels like I'm being given consent, because and I'm thinking about and I really want to acknowledge the problematics of this, that I think we might think about words as like softening or yielding or kind of not, we might think as dancers we can read consent through touch. And I'm not sure we can. I'm not sure. I think that dance and movement offers us a way for that. It definitely offers us a vehicle for understanding that consent is absolutely fluid, and I think that we can probably relate to in the moment of dancing with someone. You can sense that kind of, this is okay, this isn't okay. But I wonder the assumptions we make about, oh, this touch feels, this moment of connection, I feel like I'm being given consent. I don't think there's an answer to that. I'm really curious I'm always curious about the assumptions we make in dance, particularly in when we talk about things like embodiment, or when we assume that we're sharing an understanding. I'm not sure that's always the case.
Where does the weight lie on that? Yeah, well, it needs to be on the person giving the touch, I guess, in terms of like the consistent checking in and that kind of fluidity of consent. Yeah. But yeah,
which I guess is why that presentation offers some really interesting thinking around that, because it does seem to be proposing that there's a mutuality in that that consent and that is done somehow through a physical dialogue.
I mean, all of these things, it's very complicated. And I can imagine within, other, like a context like what this panel was particularly talking about, then that these ethical things around consent become even more not difficult to understand, maybe is not the way of framing it, but complicated.
What popped up for you in the second presentation?
The second presentation was Kiri Avalor, and they were talking about kind of borderlands, and they were talking about living in the kind of inter slices of geographical and metaphorical spaces of borderlands.
Okay.
And then the one thing that really stuck out to me was how they were talking about going beyond the binary to embrace both and rather than code switching. And that was the thing that I highlighted, because I am really, really interested in that. I'm definitely of the kind of school of thought of like feeling of binaries are just, not useful for understanding the messy, holistic nature of life and all the way in which things, intersect and unravel, and nothing feels as clean as to say it's one thing or the other. Particularly when we're talking about like identity, there are so many different kinds of difference and so many different kinds of lived experiences and intersections of those lived experiences. But the one thing that is fixed are these dominant narratives as what is normal.